Hi, we're live. Welcome to Ask Cam about employment. My name is Rosie. I think most people will be used to seeing my face by now. I'm the Partnership and Communication Lead at Citizens Advice Manchester. And today I am joined by three of my fabulous colleagues from across our service. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. So I'm going to go round in a circle from the top. So I'm going to come to you first, Tom Spillane.
Hi, yeah. So I'm Tom. I work in the advice line sector of Citizens Advice. So it's pretty much on the front line, dealing with various queries.
Wonderful, Jamie.
I'm Jamie, and I'm the operations manager for local services at CAM.
And fine, last but not least.
Okay, I'm Tom. I'm a generalist on the welfare benefits team, and I've been primarily working on the MS project.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So, guys, today we're talking about employment and essentially the kinds of issues that have cropped up for people at work, primarily through the pandemic, but obviously not limited to. So if they're not COVID specific, we can still talk about that. If you're watching and you have any questions about your rights at work, please do feel free to drop them in the comment box, and we will be able to pick those up and hopefully answer them for you. But first and foremost, or just to kick us off, we'll start chatting about the pandemic and how that's impacted on our employment advice. So what sort of changes did we see in employment advice, particularly right back at the start of the pandemic in early last year?
Do you want me to go?
Yeah, you go first, Jay.
Yeah, I think we saw a massive increase in employment inquiries, especially around furlough, because the term furlough has been around for a long time, but I don't think anybody knew it existed. So it was this new word that came out, and people didn't really know what it meant or what their rights were regarding furlough and being placed on furlough, and how it would work regarding how much they would get, because it's 80% of their salary at first and that type of thing. So we saw a massive spike in people ringing up regarding their rights regarding furlough. And also people ringing, asking should they be placed on furlough, should their workplaces shut down and things like that. So yeah, we did see a massive increase in that.
Wonderful. Anything to add, Tom and Tom? I feel like I should change my name.
Yeah, just to echo what Jamie was saying there, really. The basis of most of the queries were to do with furlough. There was a lot of confusion around what it meant. Should it be the employer that applies for furlough? Should it be the client themselves? That was one of the main questions, really. There was a lot of uncertainty around will the people be keeping the jobs for a long period of time? Is furlough a short-term measure? Is it a long-term measure? And really, there was a lot of sort of advice around that, and sort of maybe trying to tell people the structure of furlough, how it works, how much they're going to be paid, what they should expect to be paid. Unfortunately, as well, there were people that did lose their jobs as a result of the pandemic, and a lot of the advice as well came kind of redundancy based. There may have been people, certainly in my experience, that what maybe one of their colleagues was placed on furlough and maybe they've been made redundant. So was the redundancy process fair? Was the selection process fair? And there was a lot of advice around that area as well. But I think certainly going back to your question, Rosie, at the start of the pandemic, there was a lot of confusion around that and what it meant for their jobs in general.
Great, thank you. So I guess, has that, in terms of trends then, has that sort of continued? Have we seen that increased volume around employment issues? Or because now, I think, as you say, we're all kind of a bit more knowledgeable about what furlough means than we were this time last year. Has that meant that people sort of are feeling a bit more confident about their employment situation, and that they're kind of therefore not calling us as much?
Yeah, so I would say so. I would say at the start of the pandemic, that's when there was the most confusion. I'd say, although there is still uncertainty throughout the furlough period, the highest volume of calls really came around March 2020, going into April. But there is still some calls that come through now furlough based, but they have become quite limited now, I would say.
Yeah, I would say it has quietened down quite a lot regarding employment queries. We kind of saw a bit of a spike on redundancies, where employers weren't able to recover, and then they started making the workforce redundant. But it's kind of quietened down now regarding employment queries.
Yeah.
So my perspective on this has been slightly different, probably because I've been focused on project work, and so it's been a sort of different perspective in terms. I didn't get the same sort of influx of queries about furlough at the start of the process. One of the main inquiry areas that I've noticed anecdotally is people who've actually been in employment and who've either gone on furlough over the course of the pandemic, or who've been working from home and who have disabilities or health conditions that affect their ability to work. And they've either found that they were able to cope better when they've been either working from home or on furlough, or they've noticed a sort of an improvement in how they're able to cope with their disability or the health condition. And so that spate of inquiries started to come as people were starting to return back to more regular forms of work. So either going back into office or going back into on site, or working their regular hours again, or coming back off furlough. And so very often I would get people who found that they weren't able to do their job in the same way that they'd done it before, or were struggling with the readjustment to their regular working practices. And frankly, very often those inquiries would come sort of framed as inquiries where people were considering resigning, because they weren't necessarily aware of what their options would be in terms of remaining in employment with adjustments. And so very often the sort of initial query would be, what benefits would I be able to look at if I were to resign, or would I be able to access my occupational pension if I was to resign on ill health? And those are all sort of definitely things to look at in terms of resignation versus benefits. But there's also a couple of different employment issues to consider there. So reasonable adjustments, whether it's possible for the employer to help an employee or worker to remain in employment in that situation. It can lead to discussions on, for example, sick leave and sick pay while on sick leave. It can lead to discussions on statutory and contractual sick pay, different rights in a situation of redundancy or dismissal against a situation of resigning. And so that's all stuff to consider in that situation.
Yeah, that's really great. Thanks, Tom. That's really comprehensive. And I think that, I guess that is probably what is people are starting to think about now, because obviously, like as you say, furlough is sort of, we've still got a little bit of time left on the sort of furlough agreement, but people's minds may well be turning to, I'm going to have to go back to work. And as you say, they may have adjusted their life quite positively, having been on furlough or working at home. So you talked about like adjustments at work and things like that. What sort of things might people want to ask their employer about, and how do you go about broaching a question, sort of a topic like that with your employer?
Okay, so there's a range of different options. Obviously, in those circumstances, it's a good idea if you're considering it to get advice, to get in touch with the service either by the advice line or through one of the projects, for a discussion on your particular set of circumstances. But so if you have a disability under the Equality Act, and your employer knows about it or should know about it, then they may have a duty to make reasonable adjustments. Reasonable's always a big term, because reasonable depends on a variety of different factors itself in terms of what would be reasonable for your employer to do. But the types of things that your employer could make adjustments towards are working practices. So I forget the exact terminology, but policy, criterion, and practice, something along those lines. So basically, the operations and the day-to-day sort of functions of what you do in your job. They could make a change to a physical feature of your workplace. So, for example, to make it more wheelchair accessible, or to in some other way change the physical workplace to make it more possible for you to carry on with your role, or to allow you to perform your role to the best of your abilities. Or they could give you what's called an auxiliary aid, which is a specialized piece of equipment to help you with your job. So those are all things that you may be able to ask your employer about. If you're not sure about what adjustments your employer might be able to make, first of all, again, it's worth getting in touch for advice. There's an organisation called Access to Work that you may be able to contact. Usually they expect you to have spoken to your employer about it first. But with that one, I'd basically say get in touch for further advice if you're in that situation.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tom. So people who might be concerned about when furlough comes to an end, again, whether or not that's going to mean redundancy for them or potentially like some sort of change or end to their work, what when they sort of contact us through our advice line and sort of in those first stages, what would be the first sorts of things that we would offer them as advice?
Yeah, so when they first come through to us, if there is the looming prospects of redundancy, or if they are in that situation, the main thing we would do is look at their personal circumstances, maybe with the aim really to sort of look into claiming benefits, maybe. If that is, of course, the last option, and they can't, there's no chance of being re-employed by the employer or finding another job. But a lot of people are going to need the stopgap, especially financially as well. So what I found personally through the pandemic is a lot of people who were coming through weren't familiar with the benefits system. They'd never claimed benefits before. They didn't know how you do it. Was it online? Can I claim for myself? So I would offer a lot of advice around universal credit mainly. But of course, this is all dependent on the situation themselves, because of course, universal credit is means tested. So if somebody is unemployed or been made redundant, but their partner is earning, it may cancel out a universal credit claim. So that it would be going through the sort of different options, maybe national insurance, contribution-based benefits, things of that nature. But certainly I would go into their personal circumstances, find out exactly what their situation is financially in the household, if they're both working, if anybody else is claiming benefits in the household, and I would sort of advise accordingly from there. Of course, we do have specialist teams at the Citizens Advice as well. A universal credit help to claim line. Sort of in addition to that as well, there is support on the self-employment side as well. There has been grants that have been offered through the pandemic as well, because of course there is going to be businesses that have suffered because of the pandemic. So there has always been the option of the grant scheme for self-employment, and of course people who are self-employed can still claim benefits as well. It's assessed differently when you're making the claim, but certainly we can do that calculation for them people as well.
Great. That's really good to know. And you sort of preempted one of my other questions as well about like how does that look different, I guess, for self-employed people versus employed. Jamie, I think it was you before, referred to the idea of redundancies being fair, and like whether or not sort of how do you determine who can be made redundant, whether or not it's a fair process. What do we mean when we sort of talk about a fair redundancy process, and what should people be looking for?
Yeah, we'd go through redundancy and the employees' rights, really. So we'd be checking that they've been given the correct notice period, they've had the correct consultation with the employer, their options have been looked at, whether alternative jobs could be offered to them, that type of thing. And also, like, you are allowed time off to look for another job whilst in your redundancy period, and that you're getting the correct amount of redundancy pay as well for people. So that's where we would check that it's fair and that they've been selected fairly for redundancy, so that job is no longer exists. So that way the employer can make them redundant. So yeah, we would check if it's a fair process for them.
And just to go a bit off what Jamie said as well, not just with the redundancy process, because there has been a lot of queries as to whether people's employers have been acting right through this. I do feel a lot of it has to do with maybe the employers being slightly confused in certain aspects, but we had a lot of queries regarding whether the employers were keeping furlough pay or maybe not paying the full amount of furlough throughout the process as well. So it has been, although it's been obviously a lot of redundancy-based questions on the selection process. There has been a lot of clients calling into question, I suppose, their employer's integrity, maybe in terms of payments and things like that. But of course, there is always ways of challenging that with the employer and getting the facts from the employer as well, using the sort of internal grievance system, and basically checking the contracted hours and what their pay should be.
Great, thank you. I think that's really useful. Again, people need to sort of know that they are entitled to sort of look at those things and to challenge those sorts of things as and when they come up. Moving slightly off the redundancy side of things, then thinking about when people, I guess, again, people are now starting to return to the workplace. What are people's rights and what are people's main queries when it comes to health and safety and thinking about things like COVID security in the workplace? What sort of rights do people have when it comes to sort of what they can expect when being asked to return to work?
Yeah, so they can expect basically they can expect to be clear signals of distance, because a lot of people, quite rightly so, it has been a worrying time. People may have lost family members. There's been it's been quite sort of negative reporting. On the news, there's been a lot going on in the world, so people quite rightly have concerns about coming back into the workplace. As you mentioned before, Tom, a lot of people have sort of adjusted to working from home now, and they've been in their own personal space. So going to the office presents, maybe they could see it as an unnecessary risk, maybe to their health. So it's important to show in the workplace that there is clear marks as to where to walk, and there is hand sanitizer where it should be. There is the correct PPE, basically, and there is clear instructions from the employer upon returning to the office of when to wear your mask, how to maneuver around the office. So I think really it's just about the employer giving people the confidence that they have looked into this. The business isn't just going to be exactly the same as before, and they have taken COVID into account.
Great. Out of interest, if, for example, I was going to come back to the office, and I should say this is definitely not the case at Citizens Advice Manchester. We are a very COVID secure workplace. But if I came back and I was concerned about sort of, I didn't see as many hand sanitizer stations as I thought there maybe should be, or I thought people weren't wearing their masks around the office and things like that. What rights do people have to challenge that, and how should they go about that? I'm going to throw that out to either other Tom or Jamie, just for a change of pace.
So often as a first step, particularly if you already have a good relationship with your employer, but it is often an option simply to speak to your employer about issues that you have in the workplace. You should never let hesitation about being a squeaky wheel or a problem employee or what have you stop you from enforcing your own rights. But at the same time, you will have to have hopefully, if you're already happy in your work, but you will hopefully continue to have a working relationship with the company or with the employer. And so it's best to maintain that sort of positive working relationship if possible. It doesn't necessarily need to start off from a sort of adversarial position. Your employer does have a duty to perform a risk assessment about COVID risks. Your employer does have a duty to consult staff on any changes that they're making, and they do have a duty to take all of the steps that they can to make the workplace as COVID secure as they can possibly make it. So it's in the employer's best interests as well to be as COVID secure as they can be. If they're not, if you're not happy with their response to the informal process, then you may need to start looking at more formal processes. So it may be a case of writing to the employer. It could become a case of following a grievance procedure, and there are escalation points past that if things aren't being resolved. Particularly, for example, if you think that you're at high risk from coronavirus, if you have a disability or health condition that might make you at higher risk, if you're pregnant, issues that could sort of not blend in, but sort of segue into discrimination issues or reasonable adjustment, flexible working issues. for those issues where your employer is being a little bit intransigent, or you're finding that you're not able to get the results that you want by speaking to them or by following the company procedures, again, that's a situation where it might be best to start get further advice from either Citizens Advice or ACAS.
Great, thank you. Now, something you referred to there, and it's I guess it's slightly a COVID issue, but actually could really apply at any point, is the idea of being a squeaky wheel and a bit of a difficult employee. And obviously, if you're not difficult, you're just asking questions that are perfectly reasonable, but that sort of then results in action taken against you as a result. Obviously, we would recognise that as sort of discrimination in the workplace. What kind of again, what sort of rights do people have in those circumstances, and what can we do to support them?
People have a right to raise concerns, so there shouldn't really be any action taken against them if the concerns are valid. If an employee does take any action towards them, again, we will be looking at that the employee is following the correct procedure. So they are following the correct kind of, if they're looking at disciplinary action, anything like that, the employer has a set procedure that they need to follow. So checking that they are following that, advising the client on how they can challenge it, on how they can also check that whether they're in a union so they can get representation, that type of thing, that they're being informed and kept up to date properly regarding the ongoing issue. But yeah, we'd look at the length of time they've worked there, if they get dismissed, whether it could be unfair dismissal, that type of thing. So we'd look at all different aspects of it.
Great, thank you. So I guess then, apart from COVID, because it has kind of taken over our lives a little bit, but actually we've all been working in workplaces prior to that, and will continue to do so. In terms of your general rights at work, what sort of things do we sort of get queries about? I'm thinking issues around, in fact, I'll run through some of the top things that I think of. In terms of rights to paid holiday, I know that sometimes there are questions about who's entitled to paid leave and who isn't. What is there any sort of clear definition on that as to when you are entitled to be paid to have time off?
Yeah, so when you are entitled to be paid to have time off, it will be in the employment contracts as well. So everybody isn't, if it's in the employment contracts and it states that, and this will always be when you first sign up for the job and you do get the contracts of employment, it will clearly state the amount of days that you will have per year, and depending on the contract type as well, because there's so many variations of contracts, whether that be 0 hour, part-time, things like that. But certainly what I will say is whatever is in the contracts, whatever is in the employment contracts, they would have to adhere to that, and if they didn't, they would be going against their own policies essentially. So certainly someone should never be afraid to ask for paid leave, basically, if it is in the employment contracts have stated. But for instance, say if you do have a full-time contract for for the year or whatever that may be, you would be entitled to a certain amount of days paid leave. I can't now off the top of my head think of the exact amount of time. I do believe it may be along the lines of 25 to 30, but I would have to double check that. But certainly there is an allocated amount that you are entitled to, and the company have to follow that procedure.
Yeah, so this comes to a sort of, this is a wider trend within the subject of employment, is statutory minimums and contractual terms. So statutory minimums are set by the government, the legislature, as statute law, and you get statutory minimums, for example, in holiday entitlement. You get statutory minimums in sick pay. You get statutory minimums in notice period. And basically, a statutory minimum is an absolute minimum amount that the employer is allowed to give you under the law, provided that you qualify under the law. For holiday entitlement, and like Tom, I had to check it, we are humans, we do make use of the resources that we've got. But all workers, that includes employees and workers, are legally, but not the self-employed, are legally entitled to 5.6 weeks of paid holiday a year. So for a 5-day-a-week worker, somebody who works, for example, Monday to Friday, that works out at about 28 days paid leave. That can be prorated for part-time workers. So if you work less number of days in a week, you still get 5.6 weeks worth of holiday days. But the actual number of days that works out at might work out differently according to the maths of that.
Great. Thanks
for clearing that up as well, Tom.
As you say, it's we've got a lot of handy resources available to us at Citizens Advice. So we do have to look some things up, but we know exactly where to look for the information. So that's always very handy. Now, obviously, we referred to sort of contracts there. That sort of generally implies that everything's been done above board and that there is all the paperwork that somebody should have. If someone comes to us and says, oh, I don't know what it says in my contract because I've never had one, like no one's ever provided me with one, what are their rights about getting one? You know, if you've been in the job for a little while, what do you do if you haven't had a contract prior to that?
I believe it's 2 months. So you have the contract. The contract exists as your agreement for working with the employer. It's the whole offer acceptance consideration thing. So the contract exists with your employer as your agreement to work for them in exchange for example, pay, etc. The document that people refer to as the contract, and we'll call it contract for the sake of simplicity, but that document's actually called the written statement of employment particulars. And there's a list of stuff that needs to be in that under law as a document. I believe you are entitled to ask for that. So many people actually don't have a hard copy of their contract. You're entitled to ask for that after being employed with the employer, I believe, 2 months. Yes, so I believe that's the circumstance under which you get that contract formally. If you don't have one already, the simplest thing to do about it might simply be to ask.
Yeah, great, thank you. So in terms of, we've obviously covered like holiday pay. What about sick leave? Because again, I think sometimes in those kind of, particularly in more, I guess, transient jobs or like the 0 hours contracts and those sorts of slightly less, or jobs that maybe sometimes feel less secure, people may feel worried about taking time off if they're sick. What are people's rights to pay time off when they're unwell? I'm going to go to Jamie because he's not done anything in a while.
Yeah, so you are entitled to sick leave. It builds up over time. So when you start, you normally get told how many days sick leave you're entitled to. Depending on how much you earn and how long you've worked for your employer, you may be entitled to statutory sick pay as well. While taking time off, you do have to provide evidence that you are sick, obviously, to your employer, like a fit note, sick note. But you can normally get statutory sick pay for up to 28 weeks, which works out about $96.35 a week. So there is a calculation on it to check. But you are entitled to sick leave if you are employed, and it should also state if you have got an employment contract, your entitlement to sick leave.
Wonderful, thank you.
This gives me a chance to take a second bite of the cherry. It's a point that I failed to make further on earlier on. So statutory sick pay, statutory sick leave, all of that stuff, that's a statutory minimum. You can have more generous terms under your employment contract. So it is, as you tried to nudge me onto, it is always worth checking your employment contract to see whether they are offering more generous terms, for example, for sick leave. It's not massively uncommon for people to have full pay for example, 1 month, 2 months. That then reduces to statutory sick leave, to statutory sick pay, sorry. You can get more under your contract, but you can't get less. So long as you meet the criteria for statutory sick pay, you get that 28 weeks at 95 something. We can check the exact figure at some other point per week. But you might get more under your contract, but they can't pay you less.
And just following on from what Tom said as well, with statutory sick pay there, you may be able to boost your income as well. If you do find yourself on statutory sick pay, it may be significantly lower to what you would normally get. I think it's around 94.25 per week essentially, which isn't a whole lot when you've got rents, you've got your bills each month. So you may be able to top up your income with universal credit as well. So I would say anybody who's struggling financially and because of being on statutory sick pay, I would think it would be good to get a universal credit calculation, if you haven't already, to see if you can actually top up that income for the time you're on sick leave.
Great. That's really good to know. I guess it's that comfort that people know that they can take the time they need to get better with the appropriate support, isn't it? When it comes to sort of, obviously that's about if you're off sick. If your children are off sick, or actually sort of as we have sort of put a blog post up about this on our website in the last couple of days, but children who are forced to self-isolate from school, like, you know, if their bubble has closed and they've been sent home and to self-isolate, what is in terms of like parental leave or dependency leave in those circumstances, what are your rights again? I guess that there's maybe minimums around that as well, statutory minimums, and again, how can you sort of ensure that you're getting what you're entitled to there?
Yeah, so you will, again, in your employment contract, will tell you about dependency leave. You do get a certain set amount of days in order to take dependency leave, but it would generally be a chat with your employer regarding the need for childcare and things like that. So if you can't arrange alternative care and you've got to stay at home to look after your child, it may be that you might be able to go back to working from home. It may be that you do get time off for dependency leave, so you do get a certain amount of days to take, which would state in your contract. Also, whether you could look at claiming, whether you could take the time off as sick leave, that kind of thing. Or it may be that you need to take paid holiday as well. And there's also the option to take unpaid leave as well.
Great. Wonderful. So again, people have a suite of options available to them. So again, if you're concerned, I guess at any point, what we should be saying is, if any of this is sort of ringing alarm bells for you and thinking, oh God, I've asked for that, but I got told no, then you should absolutely be giving us a call to kind of talk through your circumstances in a bit more detail, I guess, because obviously sometimes there may be something within your circumstances that sort of changes what you are or aren't entitled to. But that is exactly what our advisors are here for. And then they do a great job offering up fantastic employment advice. So I think probably that was sort of in terms of the things that I wanted to cover, or the things that I could think of that people might be calling us about. But Jamie and Tom Spillane particularly, I guess, will have a broader insight. Are there other things that we sort of get asked quite often, or that sort of come up quite frequently in terms of employment and people's rights at work? And if so, what are top tips, I guess?
Yeah, so I suppose something we do get even before the pandemic as well, and as you quite rightly said, before we heard the word furlough, there was other queries as well. Discrimination in the workplace is a big one. Things like age, race, gender, religion, these types of things. You shouldn't be being singled out, or you shouldn't be being treated any differently in the workplace for any of these protected characteristics. If an employer say, if a word has been said outwardly to you that does offend you about your race, about your religion, or something like that, then there's definitely help and support that we can offer. We do have a more specialist advisor in employment who does deal with discrimination issues. So if you do feel that your employer is treating you different for any of those reasons, you can always contact our advice line, and we can take the information about the situation and see what's happened, and we can certainly have a look in to see what we can do to help. But just to be clear, there should be no instances in the workplace where you're being treated any differently because of those things. The only time it can really come into play is if not discrimination wise as such, but if your work performance is maybe below par because of your own fault, the employer would have the right to speak to you about those types of things. But if it's if the employer is indicating it's because of anything like that, your gender, age, religion, race, any one of those things, then certainly that wouldn't be right, and you can call us for further advice as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm going to pop up our contact details along the bottom of the screen there. So again, that's our advice line number there, free phone number, and also our website where you can access all sorts of digital access advice channels, so video advice. We also offer web chat advice via Facebook Messenger, via WhatsApp, all sorts of wonderful ways to get in touch with us should you need to speak to somebody. Was there anything else then, folks, that you sort of think people need to know about when it comes to be like their rights at work and how they can enforce them, or have we magically covered everything?
I think I'd just like to point out deadlines for taking further action, because it's something that people can fall foul of. So if you have raised a grievance and you're not happy with how things have gone, and you think you might be looking at a point where you may have to escalate to an employment tribunal, then it's good to be aware of the process for that and for deadlines on that. So in most cases, sorry about that. In most cases, you'll have to have gone through a process called early conciliation with an organisation called ACAS. Please don't ask me to explain what the acronym stands for, but the organisation is called ACAS, and they specialise in dealing with employment issues and disputes between employees and employers. For most issues, you'll have 3 months less 1 day from either the thing that's being complained about, or the last in a series of things that's being complained about, or in the case of dismissal, 3 months less 1 day from the date of your effective termination, to begin a process called early conciliation with ACAS. At early conciliation, ACAS will essentially deal with yourself and the employer and attempt to come to a conclusion that's sort of mutually satisfactory for you and your employer. If they're not able to come to that kind of solution, then you'll be provided with a certificate. And at that point, you'll always have at least 1 month to bring a claim to an employment tribunal. So long as you've started the process for early conciliation in time, you may have more than 1 month. There's a couple of exceptions to the 3 months less 1 day, which I noted down in preparation for this. So if you are making statutory redundancy pay claims and equal pay claims, the time limit's 6 months less 1 day from the date of leaving the job. But I think the big headline thing is, if you think that you might want to take action further to an employment tribunal, for instance, it's really important to be aware of the possible deadlines. And if you're not sure, again, do get advice from either ourselves or from ACAS.
Great, thank you. So yeah, don't sit and wait. Do get advice as soon as possible, and we'll be able to help you find your way forward with that. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time, gentlemen. It's been really informative and really useful. So thank you very much. Again, the contact details for us are running along the bottom of the screen there. And if you're watching on Facebook or via Periscope, so you've probably found us on Twitter or Facebook, all of our contact details are on there as well. So you can find us after this. But I will leave you all to your evenings, and thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back in probably a couple of weeks with another Facebook Live. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks.